I recall a fringe alt-right blogger by the name of Ryan Andrews. And he started to appear around 2014, and it's been 7 years since then, and once in every while he'll have a random 2,000 word essay appearing on Affirmative Right or somewhere like that. And you could say this is a long-term lurker of sorts. Yet it is ironic because most of his lurking hasn't much changed in close to a decade. And there is something to debunk about Ryan Andrews, and I don't believe that is his name, and it's rather a pen name of sorts. But Ryan Andrews is a flawed blogger, and only a few of us know who he is. But let me elaborate further on who Ryan Andrews is and his flawed arguments. Perhaps Ryan Andrews wants to be best known for a pulp entitled The Birth of Prudence, which was strangely published by vdare. If I recall, I believe Andrews is from the Chicago area, and he met up with a Peter Brimlow associate. I have a gay white nationalist friend who also works for vdare and sometimes films himself. And one time he tried to lure me into his gay relationship back a few years ago. But Andrew seems to talk really big about his position at vdare, and his only contribution is this pulp and some cheesy articles. But what is The Birth of Prudence about? Well, it's this corny pseudo rom-com about a white male Asian female relationship, and that the Asian female cannot be a part of Western civilization because she's genetically non-Occidental. In fact, I believe she's Korean. And the book tries to be some kind of affluent, cosmopolitan Wes Anderson rom-com of the sorts. But then you're forced to read internet posting bland arguments and kind of no apparent reason that rather it's a tragedy, that if anything was to work out, the white male Asian female relationship would be perfectly fine. Yet Andrews makes this bizarre argument is that they both come to an enlightenment realization, as if every single human being will believe that race mixing is wrong. Kind of a very William Pierce extreme white nationalist argument. And of course, Andrews is wrapped up with ideological internet things of the time, and Andrews toots his horn as being a pretentious novelist because of this, and it's actually a really poorly written piece of paper slapped together and printed on demand, to be honest. But something odd came after a few years later. A new book called Dragon Day by Matthew Pegas, which is about a student named Toby who has a dysfunctional time at undergraduate and ends up committing a mass murder on the quote-unquote Dragon Day. But it's about proselytation, being proselytized into far-right culture, or at least radical culture, for that matter, and about fleeting subcultural interest and whatnot, and all at the same time repressed sexuality, as another theme in the book. Now, the reason why I bring up Dragon Day is that this is kind of a meta-narrative about Ryan Andrews. That really Ryan Andrews is projecting his own experience with dating non-white women, or his college experience, into his own book, and why he's a lost college radical of sorts, and now he must be a white nationalist of sorts. Oh, by the way, as a discretion, if you go on Amazon and you look up The Birth of Prudence, it's attached to this Ryan Andrews. And this Ryan Andrews lives in the Japanese countryside with his Japanese wife, 2 kids, and their dog. And this is not the same Ryan Andrews who writes for vdare and Birth of Prudence. Totally different guy. But The reason why I say this is very, very ironic is because a anti-white male Asian female book is being advocated by Ryan Andrews, the real Asian Aryan, the real, uh, you know, Eurasian futurist who has a cartoon, who's a cartoonist, and one of his fans write, "Cutest little family, the Lenny Riefenstahl picturesque family of the future." So I salute this Ryan Andrews to living up to the Eurasian futurist Asian aesthetics lifestyle. So I envy him. I greatly envy him. But back onto the real Ryan Andrews now. So this Ryan Andrews, I actually was so curious with his plot, I reached out to him back in 2017 and I recorded a podcast with him for The Stark Truth. But I uploaded it on my channel as Robert was very iffy about putting radical right stuff on his blog. So I got to understand who Ryan Andrews was on a person. He comes out as a very timid, quiet, nerdy character of sorts. Very interesting, right? And he doesn't say that much. He doesn't give an explanation to his far right interest, but I kind of sense it in him that he probably comes from a Republican type of family, and that his shyness makes him the way of trying to do the right thing, but he has this angry Joker side to him, But anyway, on the Amazon page, there seems to be a bizarre, older generation in 2014, 2015 clapping and congratulating the pedestal character known as Ryan Andrews that's being advocated on vdare. A debut worth reading and thinking about. And then, Charles Hill right over here writes, "Good read, but author's point could have been made without the anti-miscegenation angle." I wonder, yeah, it's kind of pretty biased he throws that in there. Or Western civilization, unique to a particular people or universal? And kind of coming from these basic nationalist points that can be easily debunked when you start to realize that this is an ideological and subcultural thing that kind of goes into its own paleo-conservative circle jerk in a weird way. It's just a long-winded argument to say, don't race mix. Even I'll further the point here that on the Goodreads, there are more negative people about it. And I love the very, very corny tagline right here. "It's a story about love, loyalty, and the meaning of identity. And once you experience it, you'll never be able to forget." I'll never be able to forget. Like, this is like some rom-com. This is like a part of my life or something. Here, this user by the name of Gazelle gave it 1 star. And this older guy gave it 4 stars and said, "This book could have been extended into the brief history of Western civilization." So you can see there's already ideologically biased people reading this book. And only very smart people can detect how this is a pamphlet of sorts. If you recall, there was a Christian proselytizer cartoonist by the name of James T. Cheek. And if you're around, say, the Wildwood, New Jersey boardwalk, there would be random people giving out these pamphlets called "This Was Your Life." And there would be these disturbing cartoons of despair and depression that if you do the wrong thing from lust or sin, you're going to hell. There was a pretty funny one about Dungeons and Dragons, I recall. But Ryan Andrews' The Birth of Prudence reminds me of a James T. Cheek pamphlet, but a pamphlet to say, don't race mix, otherwise you're going to hell. And there's a great paternal system above you, and it's called nationalism. Something like that. I was able to dig up an old interview of sorts in 2014 where Andy Nowicki said, or at least Andrews indirectly called it, identitarian fiction, like the identitarian group who had the Dragon's Eye and was quite popular during that era. And Andrew says, the identitarian also ask, who are we? The birth of prudence also asks the question, and above all, is an attempt to answer it. It's a basic outline. The story is a tragic romance made possible by the larger tragedy of the West. And in this very, very short interview of sorts, he's very pretentious. To get across that, he even wrote an article called A Novel Ideal about a novels of ideas. And so here, Andrews is already telling his so-called audience that you too can make Trojan horse proselytizing works of literature, and a literature or the Renaissance will move our subculture forward into the capitalist market, and it will proselytize people to make them think a correct way. And again, this was 7 years ago in 2014, as if Andrews is celebrated on the pedestal from vdare. He got there, now you can get there, and here's my fake writing workshop on the matter. Well, Andrews is still up to his old game. His latest article was published on June 19th, 2021, as a review of the new Charles Murray book. But interesting enough, Andrews is very mixed when it comes to ideology, as there was a lot of twists and turns within the alternative right movement and of the dissident right sphere. And here, in this very same article, in bold, he writes, but at the end of the day, liberal individualism can never be an identity. It creates a void, and now that void is filled by anti-white identity. And, by the way, Ryan Andrews is the author of the forthcoming book, The Elective Nation, which, by the way, The Birth of Prudence did not exist. He's now only known for this fictitious book called The Elective Nation. What's left on the internet of Andrews' identity is his 2-year spree on vdare. And here you have just scant articles, including the Stark Truth interview I conducted with him. But here's an interesting one. What about the debut novel, The American Identity? Here in 2017, Andrews is also being pretentious again. I generally don't like novels set in the future, so I don't usually pay attention to this genre. However, I can't pronounce his last name. Maybe it's Bjetli, is the first author that I know of to credit my novel, The Birth of Prudence, as a stylistic inspiration, and that's a pretty good way to get my attention. Here are my thoughts on the American Identity. Good. I'm not going to show you the good, but I'm going to show you the bad. The bad, unfortunately, the author does not offer much of an answer. So in closing, I'll be blunt. What do you want in a novel? Do you like your fiction to have a little more finesse? Then maybe this one isn't for you. If, on the other hand, an elegant plot outlined is enough for you, then you might enjoy it. An elegant plot. Well, here, as Andrew's tooting his own horn and being the masters of all novel writing, especially for Trojan horse racial nationalism, let's see what else that this author has written about. Well, he has 2 other books called The Passion of Adolf Hitler and Naming the Enemy. I wonder who that Naming the Enemy is. Is it Jewish? It has 3 1-stars, and I believe this author that Andrews is advocating is an open, to use more blunt terms, white supremacist neo-Nazi based upon racial genocide in irrational terms. But that's not to say that Andrews also belongs kind of to the same canon, as throughout many articles on Affirmative Right or the old Alternative Right website from Ryan Andrews, he thinks he's a liberal. He's an ideology, using the plural pronouns in the case. We are an ideology. Or he'll throw in giant claims like theory, quote unquote, in all its types over the decades is but an extended cope, cool kid word, with the fact that not only did Marxism fail, when did Marxism fail, but radical leftism itself is ultimately an ideological void. You know, big sweeping stuff like leftist ideology does not understand that difference and competition are what makes the individual lives worth living. And wait, difference in competition, does that justify capitalism? Well, accordingly, he wrote a very seething and angry article titled, Alt-Right Goes from Would-Be Imperial Overlords to Timid Socialists, Socialism Bad. And a very blunt thing he said was, socialism is of the left, while white nationalism is of the right. Odd, isn't that? Or what really matters is the survival of the white race. Not economics, a Heideggerian racial survivor. The novice who calls himself a socialist just because he wants more Gibbs takes more rational position than an actual socialist. Again, he doesn't understand socialism. Besides, it's not necessary for white nationalism to even have a position or economics. Not that every white nationalist must be a single issue thinker. Again, he's making these basic countercurrent arguments that, white extinction should be off the menu, and therefore it never came that capitalism is threatening white people, that it is an economic issue. Dissident writers should not want to associate with such hateful losers. Again, we are an ideology. As a liberal, I'm in a subculture. Those people are wrong. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are a dead letter if the tyranny of the majority can suppress the nationalism of the individual. Wait, what? So is this guy an anti-liberal or a pro-liberal, or he only believes that a collective of racially similar genetic, quote-unquote, white people are liberals? Now, I really would like to tear apart his definition of what it means to be white. The thing right now is that Andrews is using white in the far-right term that it means admixture European people, that it is a solidified race. However, he's never kept in mind that white is on the sense of middle-class bourgeois values, and that, as I explained further in two of my lectures, What's Wrong with Whiteness, and on whiteness studies as a conspiracy and market-driven popularity, which if you haven't viewed those lectures, I strongly suggest you view them now. Here I argue is that the purpose of whiteness studies is to understand the bland notion of middle-class desires, and that whiteness is deracination. And it's not good for French, German, Irish, Italian people, anyone of European descent, because whiteness kills the hegemonic Russian, Irish, German, and replaces it with a bland whiteness of admixture European people advocating suburban nationalism. Probably Andrews thinks that's what really whiteness is. To defend against whites means to have an everlasting Trump suburban nationalist empire, and he can talk to other like-minded people to stuff white people like, and it's all well connected, right? Not, or something. His own arrogant subcultural interest. And here he makes another bland argument that my point is not that the white pop cultural aesthetic is better, though I generally lean this way. By definition, that is white supremacist. And using recent history as a gauge, the prominence of a white pop culture aesthetic does little to foster white racial identity. I just think that we are due for a white aesthetic revival. You mean like the White Art Collective? That's already happening on YouTube. Are you talking about countercurrents? Are you talking about like middle class Fancely or Christian Landers stuff white people like? Because just replace the word white with middle class and see where it gets you. And two, it may be as well be led by people interested in effecting an actual white revival. Why do you need a white revival? You just move out to Ohio, move out to the Rust Belt, move to Texas. Don't live in New York or California. It's as if, he's confusing admixture European people with middle-class interest. But ultimately, I found these pretty interesting things, that he had a series of 4 articles where he interviewed 4 other people he thought was cool in the alternative right sphere. And I always think he's a closet Asian sexual, because here he's talking Sam or Diane or Rachel or Ross, Bridget Bardon or Julie Delpy. And here he's like, he's like, yeah, but who's hotter? As if he's like forcing himself to like desire European women or something, or the Anglo-Saxon beauty, the Occidental beauty. And he's like really forcing himself. And if you're to like anything of like African or Asian or Indian, you must be like some kind of pedophile or something. Like he's really repressing his sexuality to say, this is the right sexuality. But he's shoving his sexual interest as being supreme, and it's really selfish that his Lacanian interest is not only adding up to his ideology, but it's being repressed. That men are more sexual than what he thinks he is, and he's just telling me he's a prude. And it is kind of creepy that he's putting his sexuality in here, because it's going back to the birth of prudence about his own rejection with an Asian woman. So what do I want to get away from this? Well, going back to Matthew Pecos's Dragon Day novel, the protagonist, Toby. So Ryan Andrews, the author himself, is a Toby who believes his own morality and arguments without seeing he has became a meta-narrative in Dragon Day. That Dragon Day was written for Ryan Andrews, that Ryan Andrews is a victim of this. After Unite the Right, 2014-2018 is but a bad dream, a flawed flow of arguments and subcultural chasing. And yes, there is an anti-liberal force, and something better is in the future, but we still have these lurkers on the internet named Ryan Andrews, these kind of bad dreams that appear. And Ryan Andrews is a footnote to an obscure bad dream that happened in 2014, 2015, and all his arguments are still flawed. And when he's still writing, he's going to become more and more irrelevant. And so here, the real victim is Ryan Andrews. And I don't think, with his letters that he's been writing in the past 7 years, I don't think it'll add up to any cultural movement whatsoever. And here we're just having a cultural anthropology of a sad and pathetic individual who doesn't know what he's talking about. So class dismissed, and thanks for listening.